The topic tonight is one that normally we have just a verse-by-verse Bible study. But every once in a while there's a topic that you can't sort of elude. It's really probably very controversial. Have you ever wondered about this whole issue of Sabbath and Sunday? You read all through the Bible, the Sabbath this, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, and on the one hand. On the other hand, we don't do that, do we? We worship on Sunday. And I've heard all the usual excuses, for 40, 50 years, been exposed to a lot of the arguments both ways. And it's interesting that there are some good people on both sides of that debate. How many of you here have been troubled by that one way or the other? Okay, so it's not, okay, good. That's why I finally said, nuts, we're going to just jump into this and see what we can do. Now, I should warn you in advance, we'll try to have something to offend everyone. We won't play any favorites. Some of the lawyers tell me that the definition of a satisfactory settlement is when both sides feel they've been equally cheated, see? And so we're going to talk a little bit about the Sabbath day. Some of the questions we'll try to deal with is, did God institute the Sabbath just for Israel? That's the common understanding by most Christians. Well, the Sabbath's an Old Testament thing. That's Moses' law. Well, okay. The other question is what lurks behind all this is a Christian supposed to keep the Ten Commandments? Or just 9 of them? I'm always reminded of that little cartoon that was in the New Yorker. It was a church. It had a sign out in front. The Light Church, L-I-T-E Church. We're the home of the 7.5% tithe. We have only 7 commandments, your choice. A 15-minute sermon. It had just a facetious, everything you wanted in a church and less, And so, but anyway, one of the issues, does a Christian have to keep the Sabbath? That's one of the questions that lurks in the back of our mind. Give you a lot of good, glib theological answers why not, and yet it lurks there. And if so, when did Sunday replace Saturday as the holy day? When did that happen? Where's the authority for that? Where's the text for that? And we may have some surprises by looking at the Sabbath day prophetically, which is the thing that caused me the most disturbance as I got into it. Well, let's back up before we jump into this topic and talk a little bit about our roots. You might turn with me to Genesis chapter 3. Virtually almost every major doctrine in the Bible has its roots planted in Genesis chapter 3. This first observation that we'll share or look into a little bit isn't directly related to the Sabbath day, but there's a reason I want to get into it. If you look at the first 6 verses, they're well familiar to you. That's where the serpent, the Nachash, was more subtle or clever, whatever, than any beast of the field, so forth, and said to the woman, Yea, hath God said, you shall not eat of every tree in the garden. Verse 2. And the woman said unto the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit which is in the midst of the garden, God hath said, You shall not eat it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. Now, he hadn't said, lest ye touch it, but she sort of added that, which is the first indication of some kind of a problem. Verse 4, The serpent said unto the woman, Ye shall not surely die. Now, there's Satan's steps. He hasn't changed in all these years. His first step is to cast doubt about God's word. Yea, hath God said? And the second step is to deny it or refute it in some way. Ye shall not surely die, contradicting God. For God doth surely know that the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be open, and ye shall be as God, knowing good and evil. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and the tree desired to make one wise, she took the fruit thereof and did eat, and also gave unto her husband with her, and he did eat. We're all very, very famous episode, deserving of a great deal of study. But then both of their eyes, verse 7, were open, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. Now, we normally take this idea of nakedness as you and I would jump to the conclusion of nakedness, but it may mean far more than that. We infer from other passages that, bear in mind, up until then they were sinless. They walked with God. There are some scholars that believe they were clothed with light. The challenge I usually give to a knowledgeable group is, they prove to me that Adam and Eve only lived in 3 dimensions. They probably did, but you can't prove it. We only know everything about the creation and ourselves post-curse. But the key point here is they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. That's a very, very key point. That's the beginning of religion. That's the beginning of religion in the Bible. They tried to cover themselves. All religion tries to cover itself. The rebuttal to this is, the real reason I got into all this is I want to call your attention to a verse that most people don't pick up on, and that's verse 21 of this chapter. Let's take verse 20 and 21. Verse 20. And Adam called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. Now, the rabbis will point out that that verse, especially in the Hebrew, has far more significance than simply that it was her offspring populated the earth. That's certainly the way most of us read it. Mother of all living, sure, because her sons and their sons, that started the population of the planet Earth for the last 6,000 years, whatever, right? The rabbis point out that she's the mother of all living in another sense also, because out of her came the Messiah. And so when you see any phrase like that, put Christ right in the middle of it, and it'll give it a whole other complexion, if you will. But then verse 21 says, for Adam also, and for his wife, did the Lord God make coats of skins and clothe them. This is one of these little one-liners that's dropped in there that if you're just reading the narrative doesn't seem to have much import. But if you read from here through Revelation 22 and come back, by the time you've embraced the rest of the Bible, that verse has profound significance. What's God really doing here? Giving them leather coats because they're more durable than the fig leaves they had sewn together? No. I don't think God would busy himself in that regard. What's hinted here at, it's taken for granted in a sense that the reader, if he's understands the Bible, God is teaching them that by the shedding of innocent blood they would be covered, not by their own effort. So it's a Levitical statement. That becomes very significant when you get to chapter 4 in the Cain and Abel story. We all know about Cain and Abel. Cain was a farmer, took the fruit of the ground. Abel was a shepherd, took one of the sheep. One person's offering was accepted, the other one was not. There's speculation as to why Cain's offering was not accepted. Sin lieth at the door. Some say it was just envy. Indeed, it may have been because Abel's offering was accepted. What everybody misses is the high likelihood. This is conjectural, but it's based on, I think, some good perceptions of the total body of God's Word, is that the idea of a sacrificial offering was instituted in Eden, and it was a lamb. The fact that Abel was a shepherd is not the point. He was giving an offering of faith, an offering that pointed to the ultimate lamb that was prophetically foreshadowed by Genesis 22 when Abram offered his son Isaac, etc. All through the Scripture, the pointers, the focus, the anticipation is of a cross on Calvary. As I love to characterize it, a love letter written in blood on a wooden cross some 2,000 years ago. Now, once you understand that, when you get that glimmer, suddenly verse 21 of Genesis 3 has a different implication. The whole story of Cain and Abel has another coloration. You begin to understand that. Having said all that now, the clear indication, and I don't want to spend all our evening building the background, but many of the ideas that get formalized in the Mosaic Law were planted originally in Eden. That's my premise. Don't accept it, check it out with your own study, but I want you to at least be exposed to that possibility because I think it's very fundamental. A lot of things in the Bible a lot of the myths started to clarify once you begin to realize that Genesis is a summary, not a detailed chronology. I want to ask you, how many of each animal did Moses put in the ark? Anyone have a 10? How many said 2? How many said 2? It wasn't Moses, it was Noah. Come on. I played a dirty trick. It's a little early in the evening, but you picked up the spirit of the thing right. Several of you got the right point. We all, because it's so classically summarized in children's books, 2 by 2. But I want you to take a good look at Genesis chapter 7, verse 2, in case you're not following us. In Genesis chapter 7, in verse 2, God says, "Of every clean beast thou shalt take to thee by 7s, male and female, and of the beasts that are not clean, by 2, male and his female." So as you visualize this procession going to the ark, you see 2 of each of the unclean, and 7 each of the clean. Here's the question you can spring on your biblically oriented friends. How did Noah know what was clean and unclean? There's nothing intrinsically unclean about an unclean animal. The terms are Levitical. They are ceremonial. They're ritualistic. Pork is not clean. Pork is unclean. Why? Because the pigs roll in mud? No, it's got nothing to do with it. Clean and unclean, you and I, because we've read the Bible, we've been exposed to more of the Old Testament, take for granted that, yeah, there's these two categories, clean and unclean. Clean animals were used for sacrifice. Unclean were not. Not only did they not eat them, they didn't do other things. They were two categories, but they're Levitical categories. Levitical categories. Now, what's the point I'm making? Noah, God could say that to Noah and he'd understand what he's talking about. What does that tell you? That there were institutions established long before Genesis 7. These ideas were prevalent. We know from Genesis 4, Cain and Abel gave offerings. Where are the rules? Where's the requirement? Where's the procedure? Not recorded because we don't have that level of detail back then. The idea of clean and unclean animals apparently were established back in Eden. They were later codified under Mosaic law. Do you follow what I'm saying? And by the way, Noah was declared righteous. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Was he circumcised? No, not to our knowledge. That was established in Genesis 17. Key point. Abraham, who is generally regarded as the first Jew, the way I like to upset my Jewish friends, God called called Abraham out of an idol-worshiping culture in Ur of the Chaldees and made him the first Jew. And they don't like it put that way, but he was declared righteous in Genesis 15, verse 6. He wasn't circumcised till Genesis 17. What's circumcision got to do with the righteousness? Zero. Not really zero, because he was observant. He followed God's instruction, pretty much, not perfectly. And yet he was righteous. So there are those issues that start to emerge. Now, it's interesting, the premise I'm assuming, and I think I can do it with some basis, I'm going to try to show that, is I suspect that the idea of the Sabbath was established in Eden. That's where I'm headed. Before we even get into that, I want you a little more perspective on those early chapters before we jump to it. And by the way, this idea of clean and unclean, in Ezekiel 44, I just happened to see this and I thought it was interesting. In Ezekiel 44, verses 23 and 24, there are some verses to the priests, some instructions to the priests. But what caught my eye is the linkage in the mind of the presenter, and thus planted in the priest, is the linkage between this clean and unclean idea and the Sabbath. In Ezekiel 44, verse 23, it says, "And they shall teach thy people the difference between the holy and the profane, and cause them to discern between the unclean and the clean. And in controversy they shall stand in judgment, and they shall judge it according to my judgments, and they shall keep my laws and statutes in all my assemblies, and they shall hallow my Sabbaths." There's more to the passage, but the point is these things are a package that the priest, now it's Levitical, it's speaking of Ezekiel, it's actually talking about the millennium looking back, but okay. Well, let's get at the Sabbath. That's really our subject for tonight. Having said all that, turn to Genesis chapter 2. And we'll just read, first 3 verses. Genesis chapter 2, verse 1. "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the 7th day God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made." 2 different words, created and made. How many people were around at that time? How many? 2, huh? We have sons and daughters and things coming, I think, right? A couple, maybe. Anyway, it's Adam and Eve, and if they had any children by then. I don't think they did, by the way. I think they had their children after the fall. Question: were they Jewish? Well, they were only in the sense that if you take the woman of Revelation 12, it starts with Eve as the path from which the Messiah comes, who of course is Jewish. But I mentioned, I'm sort of being tongue-in-cheek here a little bit. There's something else that I would like to get at. Maybe we should. Maybe this is where we should have started. Let's start with Genesis 1, verse 1. Let's just take a quick glimpse at Genesis chapter 1 because I want to get it to another point. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, period. 7 words. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved, brooded upon the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw the light, and that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. That's interesting. See, you and I think of darkness as the absence of light. That ain't this kind of darkness, because God separated light from darkness, 2 different things. We know that today. That's where we can talk about things like black holes and stuff. But let's move on. Verse 5. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. Or more precisely, the evening and the morning were day 1. It's expressed in a very peculiar, unique way. The others are not that way. The evening and the morning, that's what I want to focus on a little bit. The word in the Hebrew today for evening is erev. The word for morning is boker. Boker tov, good morning. Erev tov, good night. Lila tov, good evening. But anyway, because of that, it's translated appropriately, the evening and the morning were the first day. But if you start digging into the early roots of this passage, there are scholars that believe the root meaning of erev was chaos or darkness. And it became the common term for evening because that's when the sun sets, things start to become indistinct and dark. In contrast to boker, which in the morning as twilight comes, you can begin to see structure and things and colors. If you visualize the sunrise, it's dark, you can't see what's going on, but as the light comes, you can begin to discern forms and shapes and so forth. And so they see the word boker, its original concept was order. We have the evening and the morning being the first day. One of the things that we know today, using the terminology of the entropy laws, the second law of thermodynamics is that you always have a loss, right? I don't want to get into a whole thermodynamics session here, but there is entropy laws which in the thermodynamic sense are called the second law of thermodynamics, which essentially says anytime you have a transfer of energy, there's a loss. There's no such thing as 100% efficiency. There's always a loss to the ambient. The ambient is called entropy thermodynamically. In an information sense, it's randomness. Order or design is the opposite of randomness or chaos or disorder. Now, one of the things that we experience today is that the entire universe is heading towards disorder. Putting it in thermodynamics term, the entire universe is moving towards a uniform temperature. You can only do work if there's a temperature difference. And as you do work and there's a temperature difference, but you're always losing some, you're contributing to the overall ambience or entropy. And the theory is that someday, since they never see reversals of this, it's always downhill. It's as if the whole universe has been wound up and is winding down. Billions and billions of years, whenever, it'll suffer what the cosmologists would call a heat death. When there's uniform temperature, no more work can be done. You observe the entropy laws in every field of science except one. Every field of science in its own area of interest observes, recognizes, acknowledges the so-called entropy laws, except one field. That's biology, the whole concept of life. You can't create order. Order is added externally, but they ignore that. But I won't start on that one. The creation would start, using entropy terms, with maximum entropy. And when you start creating order, you're reducing entropy. Think of entropy as randomness. As you start designing, you start doing something, you are adding information. And as God creates, one view of Genesis 1 is there were 6 specific stages of entropy reduction or design or creation. And the evening and the morning, the root meaning may be the reduction of entropy. Okay? Because the evening and morning were the first day. Creation was going on. And let's read on. Verse 6. And God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters that were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. and the evening and the morning were the second day. Verse 9, and God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together in one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and gathering together of the waters he called the seas, and God saw that it was good. Every day he saw that it was good, except Monday. Interesting. And God said, let the earth bring forth vegetation and herb bearing seed, let the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth vegetation, herb yielding seed after its kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after its kind. And God saw that it was good, and the evening and the morning were the third day. And God said, let there be lights in the firmament of heaven, and divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days or for years, and let them be for lights in the firmament of heaven to give light upon the earth. And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the nights, and made the stars also. And God set them in the firmament of heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and morning were the fourth day. Each day has its achievements. Each day is a specific parsing of time. Each day is reckoned by evening and morning. It's because of this language that the Jewish calendar reckons a day beginning at sundown. You and I think of it midnight to midnight in our normal reckoning. I suppose most of us, if we had a choice, probably would think of it from morning to the next morning or something. But we go from midnight to midnight for a lot of reasons. The Jews reckon it from sundown to sundown because of this Erev and Boker issue. Verse 20, God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and the fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. God created great sea monsters, every living thing that moveth, and the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the waters in the seas. Let fowls multiply on the earth. And the evening and the morning were the fifth day. And God said, let the earth bring forth the living creatures after its kind, cattle and creeping thing, beast of the earth after its kind. It was so. And God made the beast of the earth after its kind, the cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the earth after its kind. And God saw that it was good. And then God creates man. God said, let us make man in our own image. I like the plural there. Let us make man. You got a Trinity hinted here already. And the Trinity's even in the grammar, but I won't get into that here. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth on the earth. And God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. And God blessed them, said unto them, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, and do it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, after the fowl of the air, and every living thing that moveth upon the earth. God said, behold, I've given you every herb-bearing seed which is upon the face of the earth, and every tree in which is the fruit of the tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creepeth upon the earth, wherein there is life, I have given every green herb for food. And it was so, and God saw that everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the sixth day. Let's look at the seventh day. Chapter 2, verse 1. The heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God ended the work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made, and he blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. And then goes on some summaries and some more detail about when he created man. But question, where is the evening and the morning of the seventh day? It ain't there. Which tends to confirm, in my mind at least, this perspective that the Erev and Boker are linked to the days of creation. Now, this is not why we have a 6 days of creation problem. That'll come up in Exodus. I'll come back to that. But this whole issue there are diagrams and a much more detailed discussion of this in our briefing pack called Stretching the Heavens, where we try to profile these reductions of entropy during the first 6 days. During the seventh day and following, the entropy level is described as being level. Why? Because we believe, for a number of reasons, doesn't mean we're correct, that the entropy laws had their institution in Genesis 3. And the reason we say that is that in Romans chapter 8, where it talks about the redemption, not just of you and I, but of the creation. In Romans chapter 8, it talks about how the creation is groaning to be relieved from the bondage of decay. This bondage of decay seems to be the entropy laws, which appear to be a byproduct of the curse on the earth. There's a huge discontinuity that takes place. There's several of them. One is at Genesis chapter 3, when God pronounces the curse as a result of Adam and Eve's sin. And there are many of us that have a background in physics that are also serious Bible students that believe that that's when, as part of the curse that God pronounced upon the creation, the entropy laws, the decay started towards the bondage of decay. And it has another discontinuity at the flood of Noah. The flood of Noah was far more than just a lot of water and what have you. The whole ecology of the earth changed. We even know that from the fossil records. Pterodactyls could not fly in an atmosphere of only one atmosphere and such. So there were some major ecological changes, not just the water, that the earth prior to Genesis, we have no insight at all, zero, of the creation prior to Genesis 3. We jump to all kinds of conclusions because we assume that it's the same in Genesis 4 as it was in Genesis 2. Well, I don't think so, for a lot of reasons. Also, the world changed substantially at the flood of Noah, and there's a whole other study there. And but the promise that's held out, this all takes perspective when you see the promises in the New Testament that the curse is going to be relieved. What does that really mean? More than just the lion and the lamb lying down together. They do that today. The lamb's usually inside of the lion, but they do lie down together. Okay. Now, we're going to go further on the Sabbath thing. That's really what we're trying to track. But I want to remind you here, the very, very key, in Mark 2, verse 27, there's a very, very important declaration by none other than our Lord himself. And we're going to hear more about this tonight. But he said, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Somehow this whole thing got end for end. It becomes a huge burden to some. But Jesus' declaration is, the Sabbath was made for man. God instituted the Sabbath. He used the pattern of his own rest after 6 days as his pattern. He personally stood as the example to give man a break, a blessing. To get them to understand that, he enforced it in very rigorous terms in the early period. But the intent, clearly, all along, beginning, middle, and end, is as a blessing to take advantage of. Now I'm going to suggest that Jesus' words, that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath, points to a period prior to the Ten Commandments in the original purpose and will of God. And the Sabbath came into being when man came into being. And it was set apart and blessed as a divine example. Now, where is the Sabbath first mentioned? See, it wasn't really mentioned Sabbath here. It just said the seventh day is blessed. Let's turn to Exodus 16. Exodus 16. There's a familiar story, but if there's aspects of it, I'll bet you that you may never have occurred to you. And in Exodus 16, we have the advent of the manna. How many have heard of manna? Huh? Manischewitz, manicotti, you know manna. Okay, right. Okay. First mention of the Sabbath, or the Hebrew verb Shabbat, is meaning to rest from labor, is the verb form of it. Noun is a day of rest. Is in Exodus 16, verse 23. In verse 23, I won't go through the whole story of the manna, but God says unto them, this is that which the Lord hath said, tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. Bake that which ye will bake today, seethe what ye will seethe, and that which remaineth over lay up for you to be kept until morning. Exodus 16, 23. But then he goes on in the details there that for 6 days they to gather the manna. Every night, this strange thing, this white stuff. In fact, that's what they said. What is it? That's what manna means. What's it? You know, God called it the bread of life, and other terms. But the people thought, what's this stuff? You know, that's what the word comes from. But anyway, for 6 days they would gather. It would become their staple, the food. They would never carry over for another day. Every day that was fresh. Except on Friday. On Friday, twice as much fell. Every person had to gather their own. You couldn't gather for somebody else. That was the instruction if you go through all this, which is kind of interesting. See, this bread of life's the same way, this Bible we have. Everybody has to get their own. so to speak, learn it themselves. But anyway, the point is, on that Friday, there was twice as much, they got twice as much, and that time it didn't spoil overnight. That would last them through Shabbat. The pattern of 6 and then 1 is established here in Exodus 16. But the word Sabbath day is mentioned because it's taken for granted. He doesn't explain the Sabbath day. The Sabbath day is the context in which this is instituted. You follow me? Now, what makes this relevant is this is Exodus 16. What chapter, when are the Ten Commandments given? Chapter 20. This is 4 chapters before the Ten Commandments. The point is, the Sabbath and its observation has got nothing to do with the Ten Commandments. 10 Commandments have, one of them is to honor, remember the Sabbath day, but it doesn't institute it. The institution, I believe, was back in Eden. In any case, it is operative here. This is at least a month, probably about a month before Mount Sinai. Not a big deal, except it disconnects it conceptually from Mount Sinai. The law is yet something forthcoming, you see. Chapter 16 gets into all the details. But the main point I want to leave, this is the first mention of the Sabbath, and it's before the law. By the way, the ancient Babylonian calendar also, we know from, have recovered inscriptions and the bricks along the royal palace, the Babylonians observed a week of 7 days. And the Sabbath on these inscriptions is designated the Sabbatou. And it was defined as a day of rest for the heart, a day of completion of labor. Apparently it also is an echo or a vestige, if you will, of an earlier institution. Well, let's get at it. The real thing is going to be Exodus 20. That's the 10 Commandments. How many have heard of the 10 Commandments? 20%. We're not with you. Not kidding. Got a problem here. All right. And of course, the fourth commandment is the one we're focusing on here. Verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do thou thy work, but on the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou nor thy son nor thy daughter, thy manservant, thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger which is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that in them is, and rested the 7th day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the 7th day and hallowed it. That's the fourth commandment. Next one goes on to honor thy father and thy mother and so on. Now, it's this expression here in Exodus 20 that labels the Sabbath as a uniquely Hebrew institution. Why? Because they kept it. Was this around in other cultures? There are apparently hints of it, but obviously no follow-through or injunction to keep it in this to the extent the Hebrews have. And it also becomes a very integral part of the covenant that God makes with them at Sinai, and that's amplified in Deuteronomy 4 and 5, and we won't take the time to go into all of that. I want to keep this moving here. These words are often expressed in connection with Israel being delivered from Egypt. They went down as a family. Jacob and his sons, when they all get finally together, unified under Joseph in that story, you had 70 souls down. They went down as a family of 70, but they come out 4 centuries later as a nation. The birth of the many passages in the Scripture treats the exodus of Egypt as the birth of the nation as an entity. And that's very much linked to the circumcision, and the Sabbath are among those that are distinctives of the people. Now, one of the questions here that should be lurking in our minds, yes, it's ordained to Israel in a very special sense, but its intention, its ordination, was commemorative of what? The creation. So we as objects of his creation would assume that we might indeed avail ourselves of the blessings. It was instituted for a blessing, not as a burden, as a blessing. It's put in rigorous terms to teach them the importance of it. But God takes himself seriously, we'll find out. So the Sabbath was instituted as a memorial, if you will, of the Creator. Now, question, let's not get ourselves confused. Who was the Creator? Most of us tend to read our Old Testament, well, think of him as Elohim, or God the Father. But John straightens us out on that point. Let's remind ourselves of the first 3 verses of the Gospel of John. They're very relevant to this discussion. John chapter 1, first 3 verses. In the beginning was the Logos, the Word, it's a title. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. And in him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shineth in the darkness, and darkness overcame it not. Well, let's keep going. Verse 6. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. That's not John the writer's John the Baptist, but anyway. The same was for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all men through him might believe. He was not that light, but he was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. I always remember that little two-line poem. He was crucified on a cross of wood, yet he made the hill on which it stood. It's the Lord Jesus Christ. And here's the great tragedy, verse 11. He came unto his own, but his own received him not. But verse 12. But as many as received him, to them gave he the power to become the children of God, even to them that believe on his name. And verse 14, this is a key one. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glories of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And goes on. So who's the Creator? Jesus Christ. And Colossians 1:16 and 17 emphasize it virtually the same way. Let's move on, so I don't go too long here. The whole idea of the Sabbath commemorates the Creator. It was recognized also, it's made for man. It recognized a basic need for man. The physical necessities of each of us require a day of rest. Our whole bodily welfare requires 1 day in 7 for rest. F.W. Robertson summarizes very well both moral and spiritual necessities of man demand a Sabbath. He says, quote, I am more and more assured by experience that the reason for the observance of the Sabbath lies deep in the everlasting necessities of the human nature. That as long as man is man, the blessedness of keeping it, not as a day of rest only, but as a day of spiritual rest, will never be annulled. I certainly do feel by experience the eternal obligation because of eternal necessity of the Sabbath. The soul withers without it. It thrives in proportion to its observance. The Sabbath was made for man. God made it for men in a certain spiritual state because they needed it. The need, therefore, is deeply hidden in human nature. He who can dispense with it must be holy and spiritual indeed. And he who, still unholy and unspiritual, would yet dispense with it is a man who would fain be wiser than his Maker, close quote. So he says it well. Now, it's interesting that the setting aside of 1 day in 7, not observing the Sabbath, may be one of the major sources of tension and stress in our society. We live in a society in which our whole culture, especially where we're now taxed ourselves into a position where it requires 2 incomes to survive, And as most of you are aware, under the Mosaic law, there are very strict regulations that were laid down, part to establish making this day different, to establish God's seriousness over it. In Exodus 35, we find that failing to observe it was a capital crime. That's getting serious. If you don't keep the Sabbath day, you could be executed. They don't observe that today, fortunately. All through the history of the Jews, and the notes accompanying this tape will have a lot of the references in Isaiah, Jeremiah, elsewhere of these things. And we should probably pick up 1 or 2 of them. Turn with me, if you will, to Exodus 35. Let's just examine a couple of these to get the flavor of them. Exodus 35, verses 2 and 3. 6 days shall work be done, but on the 7th day there shall be to you a holy day, a Sabbath of rest to the Lord. Whosoever doeth work therein shall be put to death. Ye shall kindle no fire throughout your habitations upon the Sabbath day. Kindle no fire. Even today, there's all kinds of elaborate preparations in a Jewish household so that they won't light a fire on the Sabbath day. If you're visiting Israel in a hotel, one of the things that you do if it's Saturday or Shabbat from Friday night on, before you get in the elevator, you look to see if it's the Sabbath elevator, because they believe, they're taught, they observe that pushing a button is work. So they go so far as not even wanting to touch a button, which means that it's an elevator. You got a 20-story hotel or something. They'll have an elevator. It stops at every floor. That's the Sabbath elevator. The more progressive hotels will have 2. One that stops at the odd floors, one at the even floors. At least you can cut the number of stops in half if you're up there on the 14th floor or wherever. what you always want to do is you look around, you'll find one of the elevators is not programmed Sabbath, and that's the one you want, so you can push 14 and go directly to 14 and not have to go through 14 stops or whatever. They call that Sabbath elevator. And from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday, that's the way the hotels are required to offer. By the way, there's some exceptions, though. Even in ancient Israel, that was the tabernacle. The priests carried on their duties in the tabernacle, Leviticus 24:8, Numbers 28:9, elsewhere. The temple, later, was full of activities, all kinds of activities. 1 Chronicles 9 and 23. You can find that all through the Chronicles to talk about it. Now, to give you some perspective here, this is a perspective that even Jesus calls attention to. If you gave circumcision to a newborn child on what day? The 8th day. Now, we know from modern medical analysis, there are clotting factors and so forth that increase to 110% on the 8th day and then go back to normal. And if you do it on the 7th day or the 9th day, there's more risk. The 8th day is medically if you're going to circumcise, that's the day you do it. It's optimum from a clotting point of view. And I'm always wondering, I can understand how we know that today because we plot the vitamin B, whatever it is, and the thrombonin and all this stuff. I've always wondered, how did Moses know that? Trial and error? I don't really... But anyway, if the 8th day from the birth of the child was on a Sabbath day, they circumcised on the Sabbath day. So that was not considered profaning the Sabbath to do something that needed to be done on that day. Follow me? And Jesus makes a point of that later in John 7, we'll see. But of course, as you can probably gather, is the perversity of man of all kinds, not just the Jews, but all of us are so perverse. They quickly perverted the Sabbath by traditions. They added all kinds of things to it. And Isaiah condemned the hypocrisy of the worshipers in Isaiah chapter 1, verses 12 and 13. But what's probably most significant is that you might turn to Isaiah 58. Isaiah interprets it for us more relevantly, perhaps, to us in chapter 58. Picking up about verse 13, last two verses of that chapter. Chapter 56, by the way, won't take the time, but most of 56 also emphasizes the importance of the Sabbath. But chapter 58, verse 13 and 14, Isaiah says, or God says through Isaiah, if thou turn away from thy foot from the Sabbath, from doing any pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord honorable, and shalt honor him, not doing thine own ways, nor finding thine own pleasure, nor speaking thine own words, then thou shalt delight thyself in the Lord, and I will cause thee to ride upon the high places of the earth, and feed thee with the heritage of Jacob thy father, for the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it. The real emphasis in Isaiah is that he defined true Sabbath keeping as turning away from one's own ways and own pleasures and taking a delight in the Lord. Picking a day and focusing on the Lord, learning about him, praising him, so forth. Now, other prophets also protested the abuse of the Sabbath. Jeremiah in Jeremiah 17, Ezekiel in chapter 22, Amos in chapter 8. And they regarded the destruction of Jerusalem and the captivities of the Jews due, at least in part, to the desecration of the Sabbath. That's in Jeremiah 17 and Ezekiel 20. Something you might know, they went when they went into the Babylon captivity, they went into captivity for 70 years. Do you know why it was 70 years? Because for 70 years they failed to keep the Sabbath of the land. I've changed subject. We're not talking about the Sabbath of the man. The Sabbath for man was 6 days you worked, 7th you rest. The Sabbath for the land is 6 years you plowed the land, 7th you rest. But they failed to do that. And in 2 Chronicles 36, 20 and 21, it tells you the reason that God says, in effect, you owe me 70. Because for 490 years, they failed to keep that law. So God collected what he felt was due him. He took it seriously. Now, Hosea predicted that God would make Israel's Sabbaths to cease because of her unfaithfulness. That's in Hosea 2, verse 11. But this cessation of the Sabbath observance was not meant to be permanent, because we find in Isaiah 66 that it would return, and in Ezekiel 44. But we'll talk about that again a little later in the study. Now, during the exile, after the exile, they go to Babylon. When they're in Babylon, temple's destroyed. They finally get released after 70 years. They go back, and during the Babylon captivity, the concept of the Sabbath increased in ceremonial prominence because it was not dependent upon a temple. Much of their life was centered around the temple. There wasn't a temple; they were slaves. But the Sabbath was something they could do wherever they were, so it increased and it scaled up in its importance. When they finally get released and go back to the land, Nehemiah ultimately is shocked to see how they haven't followed through on all this, the temple and especially the desecration of the Sabbath day. He takes all kinds of steps, and that's in Nehemiah 13. You can follow through on that. So under the reaction to their failing to keep it was the emergence of all kinds of additional codes and rules to emphasize its proper observance, all kinds of regulations and restrictions. Now, this was so successful in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah that when you get to the intertestamental period, the days of the Maccabees, the revolt against the Greeks and so forth, many chose to die rather than desecrate the Sabbath. By the time you get to the oppression under Antiochus, Epiphanes, and all that, which of course led to the Maccabean revolt, as part of reading the Torah was a capital crime, and observing the Sabbath. The Seleucid rulers were really he was really oppressive. They would rather die than desecrate the Sabbath. That's impressive. In fact, Matthias, the leader of the revolt against the tyranny of Antiochus IV, ruled that it was permissible to take up arms in self-defense on the Sabbath, 1 Maccabees 2:41. He actually had to make a ruling so they understand, yes, you could fight on the Sabbath day. They were that committed to it. But anyway, as the rules multiplied, so did the gimmicks to circumvent the rules. And all kinds of far-fetched ruses. I won't go through those. Alfred Edersheim's book deals with a lot of those, templates, ministry, and services. And no, you can't legislate devotion, and that's the intent of the Sabbath day. So this first segment of our study is really just attempted to sort of survey the concept of Shabbat, concept of Saturday as the holy day. And I think one of the things that we should recognize is that it's not restricted to being instituted by the Ten Commandments. In fact, in the Ten Commandments, when it says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, even the grammar tells you it was already understood. You're just held to remember it. And so it implies right there it was already pre-existing. So it's not uniquely Jewish. It's uniquely Jewish in the sense that it was embodied in the Mosaic Code. It's uniquely Jewish in the sense that they were required to follow it. But it was instituted, I believe, as early as Eden. And because many of the idioms of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, we find echoed in advance, if you will, in Eden, whether it's the clean and unclean issues, whether it's the idea of the offerings, whether it's the predictive offerings of the Messiah to be offered on the cross. Okay, well, that's okay, but here we are, most of us in this room, worship, our special day of acknowledgement of the Lord is on Sunday. One of the things that also I mentioned the intertestamental period after they came back from Babylon was the rise of the synagogue. Even when they built the temple finally, they still had this. The synagogue became the center of religious life in Jerusalem, even when the temple was there and so forth. And attendance was customary on the Sabbath day. We find that Jesus announced his ministry in the synagogue in Capernaum on the Sabbath day. We'll find that he always did a lot of things on the Sabbath day. And because why? He was Jewish. So they did, that was in fact the cultural pattern. He was, of course, obedient to the law. One of the things we'll find as we get into the New Testament period is that the formalism, the rigor of it, had lost sight of what it was set out to do. And so the appearance you get is that Jesus is in conflict with their concept of the Sabbath. So in that conflict, we'll get a feeling for what should be a proper balance. And that's where our difficulty is, because all of us in here have been taught, gee, Sunday is our Sabbath. Well, the Sunday is not the seventh day of the week, and the seventh day of the week is what's emphasized in Genesis. Is that important or not? Don't know. Everyone has to resolve this in their own mind. Where did we get this notion? Why do we worship on Sunday? Are we not keeping the Sabbath day by worshiping on Sunday, or are we? Those are all issues. Does a Christian have to keep the Sabbath in the Old Testament sense is a question. And what about the Ten Commandments? Is a Christian supposed to keep the Ten Commandments? We're not under the law, but are we supposed to keep the Ten Commandments? One of the commandments is to keep Shabbat. Is Sunday the Shabbat? That's an issue. And if so, if Sunday replaced Saturday, when did that happen? Where's the text? Where's the authority for that? And perhaps the biggest surprise of all to me, as I started to get into this, see, I maintain that anyone that thinks this is a simple issue hasn't studied it. And I just decided, after being troubled with it for many, many years, I thought, I'm just going to try to do a little digging on my own. Again, I've heard the Seventh-day Adventist arguments, and some of them are kind of interesting. Some of them are contrived, in my opinion. But at the same time, as you get into this, it's not as anyone thinks it's simple, hasn't studied it. But what really turned the tables for me in a certain direction was the fact what prophecy says about Shabbat.